I'm Sean Bowers, for those that may not be familiar with me. I am on the lead team here and also moonlight as an occasional teaching pastor. Over the past couple of weeks, we've been studying the parable. I'm going to just start with our discussion today by reading it. So here we go. Mark 4, the parable of the sower. Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that had gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake, while all the people were along the shore at the water's edge. He taught them many things by parables, and in his teaching said, "Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it all up. Some fell on rocky places, where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants, so that they did not bear grain. Still, other seed fell on good soil. It came up, grew and produced a crop, some multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times. Then Jesus said, 'Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear.'" So when we were prepping for this, I was reading the parable over and over again, and I kept circling back to the seed. And I know normally we focus on the soil. The soil's the variable that changes in this parable, but I just kind of kept coming to the seed. And maybe that's because my dad and both my parents grew up on farms, and we always had a garden growing up. And so the seed is an image that I'm really familiar with. And when I was thinking about Jesus on the boat and who is surrounding him, it was fishermen and it was farmers. And to me, that image makes a lot of sense in that context, right? They would have been very familiar as an agrarian community with that economy and that language and that image of seed. I don't know, though, in a modern context, I feel like that may be lost on us today. Partly, I think, because we've lost our connection. We've severed that connection to the land. I think if this were a pre-COVID Sunday, I would ask, show of hands, how many of you have held a seed and actually put it in the soil with your bare hands? How many of you can tell me the life cycle of corn or zinnia flower from the time we put it in the soil and it blooms? I was reading some REI report that says, I think most of us spend upwards of 90% of our time indoors. We just don't have that connection anymore with the land. So if I think about it from that perspective, that viewpoint of maybe that agrarian society, the seed to me becomes the most important image in this parable for me. It is literally sustenance. I think it's life. It becomes then proclamation, and I think literal truth, but then maybe also truth of the capital T kind. And then our origin story started in a garden. It feels really important to me, and I think I'm geeking out on all of this too much, but I'm a storyteller. It's what I do. And when I zero way back to my origin story, I was born in Costa Rica. I identify as an indigenous Latina woman. I go back to my Mayan roots, and there the sacred text of the Mayan worldview is the Popol Vuh. And in the Popol Vuh, humanity started from seed. And we tell the story that it was the abuelo and abuela, the grandfather and the grandmother, and that's sort of the origin story of the Popol Vuh. And it came from white corn and yellow corn. We literally came from seed. That becomes so important to me.
Well, I think literally this is a parable, right? And so with a parable, and again, you're the English teacher, you're the English professor, so how dare I even speak to this? But in that sense, a parable is hugely flexible. Almost by definition, it's sort of put out there, and then it's meant to be played with and used and edited and contextualized, right? So obviously we would want to step back and say, well, what's authorial intent in terms of what is Jesus attempting to say when he's speaking to this crowd of people on the seashore? Because he went out in his boat and he begins to communicate. And these are common people, right? These are everyday people. These are not powerful people. These are wealthy people. These are affluent people. And so you begin to ask the question, well, what is he trying to say? But
Right.
what we know is what we can play with this, and we can not only attempt to say, well, ask the question about what was going on 2,000 years ago, but we can draw parable into current reality. That's the beauty of parable. It's by definition meant to be used and played with and kind of and allow the intent to sort of live in our current reality. And so, again, if we look at a passage like this, and if this series is about riffing on this and just playing with it and seeing well, what is playing out here? Again, you so eloquently spoke to the idea of the seed, that the seed is this idea of truth,
Right.
this narrative, this force, this Christ, that it has this ability to be something that we can receive, and when we receive it, it impacts us, it marks us.
Right.
So there's that part of the parable that Jesus so eloquently, and frankly, the pressure of the story has historically been on the dirt. Like, we spend more time talking about the dirt and the ground and the tilling of it and the weeds in it, or its ability to absorb seed well. But actually, like you said earlier, a seed without it living well, and there's so much that goes
Yeah.
into a seed actually taking.
It's a miracle, right? I mean, it's a tiny little thing. It's such a fragile thing. And yet, despite all odds,
It survives sometimes,
It
right?
survives sometimes. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So you've got this seed in this, it's this truth, it's this concept, it's this idea, it's this reality that comes our way. And that could vary hugely, and that's what allows the parable to be so flexible. And then you've got this earth narrative, this soil, right? And it's by definition meant to be this absorbing reality of seed. It's and you and I arguably are the earth, or in this story, Jesus, the crowd that he's speaking to, that's the earth, that's the dirt. And he's in essence saying to this crowd, are you in a place to receive truth? Are you in a place to absorb truth? For some of you, I'm going to communicate truth, and it's going to fall on earth that is loaded with weeds and thorns and ground that will not absorb that seed well. And then for some of you, you're absolutely ready. You're ripe to hear truth. You're ripe to hear a nuance and a reality. And so I look at what's going on now for us in COVID. I look at the crap storm that was this week.
Yeah.
You literally wake up every day and you're like, this is just a crazy reality with which we live. And what it's doing for, I think, a lot of us is it's forcing us to say, what kind of earth am I becoming?
Yeah.
What kind of earth am I allowing myself to be as I'm hearing, I guess it's truth sometimes, and how I filter that and how I absorb that. And then other times when I hear really good truth, and what do I do with that? And how do I allow that to be a reality?
Yeah, I mean, so again, having grown things in a summer garden, not a huge
I have
garden.
no concept. I don't have a green thumb at all, so the metaphor
One of
is...
my chores was to pick the salad, and it literally meant to go outside and pick the salad. But there's an unearthing that I think has to happen. And a lot of times that feels really counterintuitive, right? To sort of tear at the soil of something or to dig at the top layer. And I think I equate that to a little bit deconstruction, or what I sometimes call decolonization. I've lived most of my life in the United States receiving messages about my identity group from people that are not my identity group, right? And so to begin to unearth that, to begin to unearth the narratives that have been told about me, either incorrectly or not holistically, or untruth, right? And so, or even in my sort of, I think anybody who grew up with a church experience and then walked away from it maybe for a season, you might understand that unearthing to be deconstruction. What does it mean to take your value set and look at it in a new way, and not necessarily discard it, but to unearth some of those things, right? Tilling is actually a really violent way of farming. There's a really good documentary. It's called Kiss the Ground. It started out as a book, but if you want the Cliff Notes version of it, I would just recommend watching the documentary on Netflix. And it talks about soil being critical to reversing climate change. A lot of times we focus on behaviors that will stop our carbon footprint or reduce our carbon footprint, but I don't see a national conversation about reversing climate change. And in this documentary, the kingpin in all of this is the soil. If you tend to the soil and you do good work with the soil, it can actually capture carbon and reverse climate change. But
So there's life in soil.
there's life in soil, yeah. They were calling it, they say that they're soil farmers, that the livestock that they have is the soil.
You had
right?
shared earlier that with me when we were talking that not only is it violent, but often sometimes the way we farm, the way we turn the soil actually can be destructive. We can go too deep with it as opposed to staying sort of more surface with it, and that creates a space where seed does not survive well.
Right, it's sort of modern farming is tilling, it's drilling down, and there's a push for a more greener practice that's no-till soil, right?
Yeah.
Which is to just gently take the topsoil, unearth it, to let a field lay fallow for a season.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there in that notion of what it means to be healthy soil and what it means to unearth something.
So you used a word before, deconstruction, this idea of unearthing. For some of you might be this experience in your story where you walk into a watershed or into a faith journey, or you go through a season of pain, and something resets how you experience faith, how you see God. And it's as though you're being tilled and seeing life in a complete different reality. Like maybe you had an assumption about God. You had an assumption about a theological construct. You had an assumption about virgin birth. You had an assumption about miracles and the Christ and Jesus and all these parts of your journey growing up, and you began to re-edit them. You began to ask more complex questions. You began to till the soil, and invariably you came to you've come to a different reality, or you are in that journey right now, moving towards a different reality. And I saw this in preface even just a couple weeks ago, where there's people in that space who sit really well with this idea of their lives being tilled, and then there's others that are saying, I'm not there yet. I'm not ready for that to happen. But it's like you can see the journey sort of playing out. And what began to, I think for many of us, we had this. Again, the word deconstruction, it's a word that has a technical meaning, but I think at times it loses. I think it's a dangerous word. But the counter word to that is this sort of reconstruction, right? That we've tore things down and we've tilled things up, and now we've reconstructed. And the reconstruction is maybe the growth. It's that seed taking, because the soil is now ready to hear that.
Maybe a better word is regeneration for that.
Well said.
Possibly.
Well said. Yeah, absolutely. So what has happened for many of us? So you look at your faith journey and you say, well, for many of us in this room, the ultimate worldview that you have, for many of you on the digital space right now, the ultimate worldview that you have is this sort of trust in this essence that is God. This idea of God being the centerpiece, the most valuable pursuit, the most valuable element of how you engage reality, maybe the most valuable sort of seed. Mm-hmm. And when that becomes tested, when you turn up the earth and you test sort of the grid with which you've come to faith, and that begins to go away in terms of how you once saw it, and it begins to be re-engaged differently. You begin to say, well, if I can do that with the most important worldview, with that being God, clearly I can do that with other areas of my life that might not be as or perceived as valuable or as heightened in my own identity. So we begin to re-question and rethink and till up the soil of politics, right? That all of a sudden, wait a minute, maybe I don't just vote party, or I don't just vote because my parents did it this way, but I'm resetting how I see my vote. Or maybe how we see economics or the economy or democracy or lack thereof. Or war or the U.S. involvement in the global reality or a pandemic. You begin to re-edit how we see these things, and the soil begins to be sort of turned up. If I can take that metaphor and bring it to Watershed, there have been so many stories within, not just individually in your guys' lives and your lives out there, but in the system that is this community that we have had to reset.
Yeah.
And so if I take like just a 2-minute arc of history over 15 years, when we first started out, we were not, and ashamedly so now, we were not an affirming community. We were not a community that said, all right, if you are a part of the LGBTQ family, that you're welcome to be here, but there were some nuances that you were not welcome to be a part of. And we're ashamed of that. But in the day, it was as though our LGBTQ community were saying, no, here's some truth you need to hear, Watershed.
Throwing seed.
They were throwing seed, right? This is the community that you're missing out on not being a part here. And so what did our LGBTQ community do? They sat with it. They continued to sort of throw that truth. And they began to till the soil until Watershed, till we as leadership said, you know what, we need to hear this. Oh my goodness, not only do we need to hear this, what have we missed out on by not having these people be a part of this Watershed community? And that took several years. I wish it could have happened a little bit quicker, and we've not perfected it, but it's an area that now there's full integration into that part of who we are. I look back, or even though the last 18 to 24 months, our community of color, of which, Sean, you have been such a voice in, to say, hey guys, we need to till the soil so that the voice of color here is not only heard, but is integrated. And we begin to realize, and we thought that was happening in a sense, but begin to realize, no, there's other ways that it can happen more beautifully. And began to realize we need to reset in how we see that. And there's another part of that Watershed story. Again, Sean, you were hugely involved in helping us sort of wake up and unearthing that soil of what does it mean for our women to have a voice here? I think one of the most dangerous realities is when you think you've got it figured out and you don't, and everybody else knows you don't have it figured out, but you don't, right? That's the most dangerous kind of person in a sense. And I think for years we thought here at Watershed, well, because women are leading in such prolific ways here, then, well, clearly we're giving women an opportunity to have a voice here. Clearly women are informing us. They're a part of our lead team. So we're doing that. If nothing else, we're doing that part right.
Right. Well, right. You saw a garden. Things were blooming, but I think we lacked the creativity to see what that garden could look like, right? So it may have only been one type of seed, and we weren't realizing how much more beautiful this tapestry could be.
And so we ended up saying to people like the Shawns in our community, like, well, you guys had to till. You guys had to push. You guys had to say, hey, it could be better if there were more voices that weren't just a couple of dudes on stage on a Sunday morning. And we began to realize that, well, yeah, we need to move towards this. And then once we move towards it, that we not only find that that was necessary, but it's better. It's significantly better. So I kind of have this question for you, Sean.
Yeah.
I mean, you sat with that for a lot of years. I mean, you've been here for 13 or plus years, it feels like.
Yeah.
So why and how were you able to sit with that?
So there's it's loosely attributed to a Mexican proverb, although I've also heard it attributed to other spaces. So I want to make sure that maybe I say it's anonymous. But there's a Mexican proverb that says they tried to bury us. They didn't realize we were seed. And I think, and I'm going to just speak from my lens as a Latina, Black and brown bodies walk through the world understanding what resistance means in a way that is not a negative thing. I think about like that scrappy little daffodil that pops up in a sidewalk. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? Like it just, like, what? The miracle of a seed that can grow through a concrete pad with the tiniest bit of soil and defies every sort of element and says, no, you will see me, right? And we might just cast it off as just a weed, but you ever have dandelion tea, it's very, very healthy for you. I recommend it, right? But we have these things, right? It pushes through the soil. That is resistance. And that has happened. I think it's possibly hardwired into the DNA of the existence of biopic people,
Yeah.
right? I think about enslaved persons in the cotton fields of Louisiana, maybe, who were singing what everybody believed to be gospel songs, and were in fact these coded messages to move a package, a person, through an underground railroad. That's resistance, right? Resistance, I think sometimes gets a bad rap, or might be viewed through a different lens that is not the lens of other and gets mistaken. Resistance is that flower that says, you will not bury me. And
So
I think
resistance is good. It's a
Yeah,
good
resistance
thing.
is good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it allows folks to have that sustainability, that endurance to fight injustice or whatever it may be, and it helps us stick with community because we can see and believe it'll
Yes.
get better.
So this idea of earth and the seed and it growing, there's so much against its survival, right? There's so much, and so when it pops through that cement crack, it to some it might be a weed, and to others it might be beauty, right?
Yeah.
And to realize that there is that resistance. I have to admit, again, being a white male who has maybe been threatened by the idea of resistance, hearing it from you as my sister, saying, now I see the beauty in that. And that resistance pushed up against us here at Watershed made us literally a more beautiful community, and a better community. So yeah, that's so powerful. So I look at this parable, and it has different meaning to me today than it did in my evangelical upbringing and my evangelical roots.
It was a conversion story for you?
It was, right? It was about people out there. So I take it to like another gospel, Matthew.
Right.
And he writes of Jesus speaking this idea that the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. You might have heard this, and we often use that as a passage that there's people out there that need quote unquote conversion, or they need to get saved, or they need to get fixed. And I have the truth, or you and I have the truth. It's the few of us, and everybody else doesn't have the truth. And our goal is to get that truth out there. And there's people that arguably want it because thus the harvest is plentiful, but there's few of us to communicate it. And that is not at all who Jesus is speaking to in a sense. In a sense, this crowd is already sort of saved. They have a way of looking at who they are. In a sense, they're more saved than those who don't think they are, or who think they are, the powerful, the affluent, the wealthy. And so what ends up happening is they look at a passage like this, and Jesus is speaking to this to the socioeconomically challenged community, this group of people.
Right.
They're not powerful. They're not elitist. And
They're disenfranchised, right?
Disenfranchised,
Very
very much
little
so.
political power within this group.
Absolutely. So when Jesus is saying, hey, there's a need for workers, what he's saying is, I think anyways, he said, this story is about dismantling oppression. And there is a need for people who will be a part of helping dismantle that oppression, whether they're the oppressed
Right.
or whether they're non-oppressed, but nonetheless they jump into that space and use their affluence and they use their power for those opportunities. That narrative right there, the idea of dismantling oppression, has been something that has been relatively new to many of us in Watershed, and has been a part of our story the last year or so as we're continuing to grow into it and wake up to it. And if I can be honest, the conversation of the summer, Sean, has been really, really hard. Because, the whole narrative, the whole arc of the summer of Black Lives Matter has been so good for us as Watershed and our community of color, kind of helping us wake up to the role that we need to play in that, and finding that the summer was really informed, our speakers, our interviews, the conversations on Sunday was deeply informed by that. And for some, the stamina to sit in that was just not there. And then there's some that the stamina wasn't there, but they pushed into it and said, I need to develop that, right?
Right, yeah.
And For some, though, the stamina wasn't there. It's been a hard summer because people who have been a part of this community for a decade plus are friends. I mean, people I've had dozens of meals with and hours of time with said, this is too hard. This is too hard to converse over. And so we look at it, and it's like the soil is continually being distilled in this. And this conversation that, again, as a parable, we can play with it.
Oh, yeah.
But it's like Jesus might have been saying, this is a conversation about dismantling oppression.
I mean, I think so, right? Again, if I go back to the audience, the fishermen and the farmers would know where to plant seed. So the whole, like, I'm going to drop this right here in this thorny bush that looks like a good idea. I'm not, right? They would know better. But I think he's giving them a message of hope in that political context, and I think it's also a sense of agency. And what I would say to someone who's been sitting in this space with us all summer, and it's been hard, I hear that. There's something that, as we try to move from allyship to co-conspiratorship, or as we try to make tractions in that, there is an unearthing that has to happen, but we don't sow for a season and then we walk away and good, right? It's a regenerative cycle. You have a summer garden, and then when that goes, you retill again a little bit, and then you plant your winter garden, and then you can, because you know there's nothing that's going to be, in the harsh months of winter. And so to sow and to farm is to know those things and to understand that it's seasonal work. And I think there is a sustainability and a sort of a running the marathon type of thing that needs to happen. Farmers will let a field go fallow, which is to literally say, I'm not going to make money off of this acre or whatever it is of land because I know it needs to regenerate. We have a sabbatical, right? That day of rest for that. I think for that reason, to fight a good fight, you have to. Rest is part of resistance. And if you're feeling weary or tired or almost sort of like hesitant, I really don't want to plug in this Sunday, I don't know, give yourself some grace there and think about what it means to do this work the way farmers do, in and out, right? And what does it mean to rest?
When everything is really crazy right now, we don't know what's going to be happening 30 days from now with an election. And we literally sit as a teaching team, and we have these series planned out for the next 6 months, but we're literally saying, what does it mean 4 weeks from now, 5 weeks from now to show up on a Sunday? And how do we engage what's going to happen? We have no idea, right?
Right, oh yeah.
So, or what's going on with COVID or jobs or our kids in school. A ton of you are, I was talking with you before we started here, a bunch of you are CMS teachers or administration. So you're living in the unknown. You literally don't know what's going to happen next month. I heard you talking about it. So is this story laden with hope?
I think so, yeah. I mean, again, he's using language that these folks who are literally sitting and listening to it are very intimate with. They have an intimate relationship with the land, and they know that the land produces fruit if they pay any attention to it, right? And so for me, that is, to be a farmer, to plant a seed is to believe in tomorrow. Like you're putting this tiny little thing, and you're like, this summer, the boys, we planted sunflowers. And every day they're like, is it ready? What's happening? And they would look, and I'm like, no, look, there's a ton of things that can happen. And we had bird feeders with sunflower seeds, and they noticed a sunflower popped up in our mint pot. They were like, how did that happen? And it's just been such a beautiful lesson in understanding like the resilience of seed and how it works. And they're 7, and they're just kind of excited about all the possibilities of that. And I to teach them, we're putting something in the ground, and we're going to water it, and we're going to do some minimal things to it, and it will produce fruit. Yeah. That's right. That's to believe in tomorrow in a way that your efforts will bloom. They will produce fruit.
So you found this piece, this poem.
Yeah.
And you were talking about this past week, and it just is kind of meaningful. would you?
Yeah,
wanna kinda go
maybe
there?
I'll, if it's okay with everyone, all 10 of you here, I love seeing your faces. Close us out in
Yeah.
prayer, and then I'd like to end on a poem. So yeah, God, help us here. Help us to be good soil and to be good sowers, and help us to see the seed in ourselves. I think you use the language of resistance. I think you come around the most disenfranchised. I think you see the potential in us to bloom. Thank you. Thank you for the way you love us. Thank you, as Seth said earlier, for that moment between breaths. Maybe this year, maybe 2020 is the most epic of fallow seasons. Maybe it's the year we let ourselves regenerate. Help us to plant good seed. This is a poem by Ross Gay, A Small Needful Fact is that Eric Gardner worked for some time for the Parks and Rec Horticulture Department, which means perhaps with his very large hands, perhaps in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants, which in most likelihood, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow. Continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe.
Thank you, Sean, for this morning. I'm excited about this series. And I challenge you guys maybe to sit with this passage, maybe to read it a couple times this week. Next week, I'm really looking forward to some of the conversations that's going to be happening next week. It's going to be a continuation of this. And thank you Sean, thanks for taking the time this week. I've really enjoyed this as always, just our
Thanks for
conversation.
having me. It's good to be here. Feels like home.
You 10 at 10, thank you for being here. It's good to see faces. It's good to hear somebody actually laugh or clap or something, respond to something, so that's nice. And again, we'd love to have you sign up to be a part of the overflow space next week and the 10 at 10 as well. And love you, Watershed. Thanks for being with us today.
Have a good week.